Hi, everyone. This is Megan.
And this is Steven.
And this is the Synchrony Podcast, where we talk about transforming apostolic dating culture and ending loneliness in the church. And I am nervous and excited to welcome people. Well, we're not in the shed. This is not the shed.
It's true. It's true.
We are in a corner of our house recording this. You guys can see the wall art.
Yeah.
The abstract performance art signals that my children have left behind us on the wall. So yeah, this is a new thing. It's a work in progress.
It is a weekend of a hyperfixation on my end.
You rearranging our entire house to make this happen.
Yeah.
We live in a very small house, so that's sort of like, you remember those like puzzles you used to get when you were a kid that had like the little squares that slid around?
Yeah.
In the bigger square.
I love those.
I'm sure you did. I would throw those things across a room.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what it was like to make this happen in our very tiny house. Just shuffling bits and pieces around for a couple hours.
It was a needed upgrade because y'all didn't know this, but when we recorded our podcast, it was in our shed and we had to turn off our AC because it was too loud in the background.
We live in Florida. Reminder, summer in Florida. Very balmy.
Yeah.
Gross.
So we would often be sweating like crazy near the end of our podcast.
Yeah, not cute.
So now we're in our house and we're just going to have to protect our podcast setup from our children and animals.
Yeah, there's a remarkable number of animals in this room with us right now.
Two cats and a dog.
2 cats and a dog. They do belong to us. It's not like there's just random like forest creatures in here or anything, but it's a decent number of animals compared to people.
Yep.
There are more animals than people in this room right now, babe.
It's true.
I'm also nervous a little bit and excited about the topic we're talking about today. So I think that we should start off by saying this because it's important for some people. We're going to be talking about purity culture, and that's a big, charged, kind of buzzwordy term these days. Really what we're going to be talking about is our dating culture as apostolics and how it's handled the purity movement of the 90s and early 2000s, and the effect that that's had on us personally.
Yeah.
We're not going to try to extrapolate out to the entire apostolic movement because we were not part of every youth group and we don't know how everyone experienced that. So we're going to talk about how it impacted us. This is also going to be a podcast where we talk about sex, and we're not going to get gratuitous with it. We're not talking about the details of sex, but we're talking to a group of single people, and I want to be clear about that because I think that it's healthy for apostolic singles to talk about sex and sexuality. That's part of who we are as human beings.
Yep.
But you know your own boundaries and you know your own limits, and if you're the type of person who really just doesn't want to be having those conversations right now at the stage of life that you're in, this is your invitation to skip all the way to the end where we do the announcements instead of listening to the content. But I think this will be good. We're just going to touch on a topic that I think we're going to revisit quite a bit on the podcast.
Yeah.
But this will be kind of the entree.
All right. Where are we going with this?
Okay. Let me ask this. So what were your experiences as a young person learning about sexual purity? Like, did you guys have any kind of a big discussion about it as in your youth group? Like, what did that look like for you?
I mean, I'm sure it differed between the men and women, but there wasn't a big discussion about like sex per se.
Mm-hmm.
It was basically just saying don't have it.
Yeah, I mean, like, did you guys have like a whole like unit on it? Like, did you guys have like a concerted thing about it? Because we did, and I'm curious if it was the same for you.
I'm sorry for any youth leaders that may be watching this from my childhood. If we did, it obviously didn't make an impact. Like it was
did not stick.
Yeah, well, I mean, and if we did have something, it was like one segment, maybe two, and then that was it. And then like I felt bad for any other following new members of the church that missed the boat. You know, so it wasn't a super heavy topic,
Mm.
and as a result, I think it just went undiscussed and open. And we did have conversations, obviously, with like friends and stuff about it. But the conversations we did have in youth group were more, again, what not to do and don't look at porn.
Okay. So that sounds like your youth group took the, I would say, the more subtle approach.
Yeah.
Maybe to topics about purity and sex.
At least with the guys.
Right.
I cannot speak for the girls.
My church was a little bit more direct in conversations about that. And again, like, I want to make sure I say this up front. I think that the youth team and the folks that were putting this together were doing this with the absolute best of intentions.
Oh, absolutely.
We're going to talk about why it got a little complicated for me as a result of this, but I think everyone had their hearts in the right place.
Yeah.
But my church actually hosted a rally for a while called Great to Wait. And that later became Operation Rescue.
Great to Wait.
Great to Wait. Yep.
Oh, man.
I buckle in. It gets better. We had, when I first got into the youth group, so in our church, you joined the youth group when you were 12, right? When I first got into the youth group, not long after, there was a series that we went through as a youth group for like a couple of months called It's Not Sex O'Clock.
Oh, boy.
Yep. And we talked a lot about sex. There was a session where they invited young people and parents to watch a recording of a kind of like a Christian motivational speaker who was talking about purity. And I don't remember much about what she talked about, except I remember her viscerally describing a botched abortion process and what it did to the internal organs of the girl that suffered through that.
Yeah.
Very descriptive, very graphic. And we had one book that was circulating through our youth group that our youth team read, that we did sort of like book clubs and Bible studies with, called I Kissed Dating Goodbye.
Yeah, I got about halfway through that book, which is saying something.
That is saying something. You hate reading.
I made it halfway through a book, but
Wow.
I didn't finish it.
Okay, so obviously there was someone in your youth group or at your church talking about this stuff. Like
maybe, or I heard it at a rally, and
Yeah.
I was motivated because I was maybe in between relationships or something. I don't know.
Right. It was in the air, right? It was in the zeitgeist. And we were in the youth group in the early 2000s,
Yeah.
right? So I want to talk about what that experience of, like, that was happening for me right as I was getting to be old enough to start really being interested in guys.
Yeah.
And I will say I started dating at a young age, an age well before I would recommend anybody dating.
How old were you?
13.
Okay.
I was 13 when I
was 15.
Yeah, when I had someone that I considered to be sort of a first boyfriend, and it was very immature, and I mean, it was a silly relationship, right? It wasn't something substantial by any stretch, but I considered it at the time to be that was the marker, like the rite of passage, right?
Sure.
So I was really interested in guys at the time that this was happening, and I was getting a lot of messaging about the dangers of dating relationships.
Yeah.
And how problematic the outcomes could be if you didn't do them right. And I think that it did influence how I viewed dating.
Yeah.
And had some adverse effects. But before we get into how it affected us personally, I have gone down a research rabbit hole, and I have to take you down the same rabbit hole first.
Okay.
So I'm going to put on my like religious studies geek hat for a second. Okay.
All right.
Not that I ever really take that hat off, but
you don't.
Yeah, I'm just going to tighten it down a little bit. So, modern studies of Pentecostalism, secular studies of Pentecostalism, right? So people who are not Pentecostal, who study the Pentecostal movement, heads up, that's a big thing. There's a lot of people out there who talk about apostolics in an academic setting. Have said for a long time that Pentecostalism has been really successful in the sense that it's continuing to grow and develop, and new churches are being built, and the population continues to increase because of how Pentecostals and our doctrine interacts with modern culture, right?
Okay.
Grant Wacker is one of the kind of seminal voices in Pentecostal studies, and he talks about this tension between what he calls primitivism and pragmatism. Primitivism is the idea that we stick to our guns about very, very specific doctrine and scripture, but pragmatism is this willingness to engage with modern culture and respond to it and discuss it, right?
Okay.
And that has been a key strategy of our movement, right? Pentecostals were some of the first ones to start using radio as a way to evangelize. We were willing to adopt new technologies when other religious groups were saying that they, that the devil lived in the sound box in the sitting room, right? So it's interesting. It's intention though, because
Yeah.
we have our own kind of hard boundaries that we draw around things. So what I didn't realize until I started researching, oftentimes what happens with our church is that we'll see a big cultural movement happen in the world, and then the church will respond with sort of an equally forceful counteroffensive within our culture. This isn't to say that our doctrine changes at all to reflect changes in the world, but our culture will make a shift, right? I had not put two and two together, but the early 90s were following on the heels of the AIDS crisis.
Yeah.
And teenage pregnancies were at a massive, massive peak. So I was looking at some data. Let me pull up this article. And I will do my best to cite sources as I'm talking about this and link articles in the show notes if we can, because I want to be, cognizant of making sure that I cite my sources and I'm, giving good data. But this was actually a study or a report that was given to Congress in 1995. Okay, so this was a congressional report, right? Congressional report from the Department of Health and Human Services from 1995. And they have this amazing graph about the proportion of births to unmarried women from 1940 to 1993. So in 1940, it's hovering right around 3% of births are to unmarried women in the United States.
That's really low.
Yeah, 3%. By the time it gets to 1993, it's 30%. So just think about the difference, right? We went from 3% to almost 1 out of 3 births is to an unmarried woman. How nuts is that?
It's insane.
So by the time the 90s have hit, and if you look at this graph, it's just this it's like going off the charts between the 40s and the 90s, this incredible slope. So there's this massive increase in teenage pregnancies in particular, right? And we're on the heels of the AIDS epidemic.
Sure.
And that's when purity culture, that was kind of like the crucible that purity culture started to develop in. So that was the wave that was happening in the world. And the church puts up a defense against that, right? And that defense was a lot of language around the dangers associated with dating and the dangers associated with sexuality and immoral sexual behavior. And there is nothing wrong with saying that sex outside of marriage is sinful, right?
Yeah.
But I think the proportion at which that was discussed and how it was discussed changed my view of what dating and sexuality was for me personally. So yeah, I had no idea. I hadn't really put all the pieces together of that puzzle until I sat down and looked at it, that there had been all these threats that had kind of shown up in really big, bold, grand ways right before this really became a thing for the church. And that's kind of what we were speaking back to.
I mean, isn't that a part of, I don't want to say the role of the church, because some of it has to do with fear, but that's basically the job of the pastor, is to recognize a threat and say, hey, let's put up some guards to try to protect from this threat, put up some fences. So they were just responding to the threats of the time.
Yeah. And that's honestly, like that's one of the, I think a beautiful part of our culture as a movement.
Yeah.
We do speak to what's happening in the modern day, and we are willing to adapt our processes, or willing to adapt our cultural trends
Yeah.
in order to maintain our separation, which is beautiful, because separation from the world is doctrine,
Yeah.
right? How we separate sometimes changes a little bit over time.
Sure.
The exact ways in which we distinguish ourselves from the world changes as the world changes, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, the Bible doesn't talk about how to handle what you watch on TV.
Yeah.
So we adopt new
Thou
practices.
shalt not watch Netflix.
Right. So we adopt new practices now to demonstrate our separateness from the things of the world. And it's beautiful. It's one of the ways that I think we as a church continue to remain really relevant in the times that we're in.
Yeah.
But this is for every strength, there's a corresponding weakness, right? The other edge to this, a very effective sword, is that we sometimes tend to do what I call like the fool in the shower move,
Yeah.
where, the story is the fool gets in the shower and turns on the water and it's too cold. So he turns it all the way to hot and scalds himself. So he turns it all the way back to cold and freezes and just continues to do that until he gives up. So sometimes we overcorrect.
Yeah.
Is the takeaway. And I don't think every church did this,
Oh, of course not.
but
I mean, every church has done it in some way. Like,
yeah, every
and
church
that's just
experienced
because
that to
we're
some
human,
degree. Right.
Doesn't matter the denomination. We've all
Right.
been there.
Yeah, I mean, the early church was doing this, right? Of forcing everyone who converted to go get circumcised. Like, chill out, bro.
Yeah.
And so this is just part of who we are. But the process affected me, I think, and I'm curious if it affected you in the same way, just how this stuff was kind of moving in culture. So I think the two things that it did for me was that in the moment when I was coming into an awareness of my sexuality, I was made to be afraid of it.
Yeah.
And shameful about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the world creates some of that too. Like, this isn't just the church doing this to me. I think
Sure.
there was a lot of voices in just the culture of the times that we were in that were telling me that. But as a 13, 14, 15-year-old girl who was experiencing sexual desire, sexual interest for the first time, I was also being inundated with messages about how dangerous that was.
Yep.
And that was a little bit complicating for me, I think. Did you feel that way when you were starting to kind of experience like sexual interest in women? Did you feel shame around it?
I mean, naturally. I mean, because you hear all these messages saying, and again, sorry, you hear these messages saying to not do something, and if you do this, it is shameful.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that being said, that might not be what the message is actually being preached.
Right. That might not be the words that are coming over the pulpit.
But as a teenager who has not been taught what to do properly,
mm-hmm.
and even in my situation, I didn't have a father to be able to teach me because he passed away. So
Right.
that is even exacerbated by not having a fatherly role in my life other than spiritual leaders.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens is, as a teenage boy who is coming to like sexual maturity, it's on your mind a lot.
Yeah.
And so as a result, you feel guilty,
mm-hmm.
and you don't know what to do with that guilt. Because here's the thing, it's not like you're like choosing to not rob a bank, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or choosing to steal candy from a store. Whereas that can be taught. You can say, hey, I'm going to choose not to do that action.
Right. You can't choose to not be a sexual being.
Yeah. You cannot choose to just detach yourself. And so when you have thoughts that are invasive, when you like enjoy being around the opposite sex
mm-hmm.
in just casual conversation, when those thoughts pop in your mind, you're naturally like filled with shame.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, you don't know what to do with that other than praying. Don't get me wrong. That's fantastic. Praying is great. But what are the action steps?
Right.
What do you do with those emotions? What do you like? Because, now because we're getting married later and later. I know we're going to talk about this later, but we're getting married later and later, and our sexual like awakening, if you want to call it that, happens earlier and earlier in life with younger and younger puberty. What's happening is we have this massive season of our life where we have to say, no, let's not talk about this and let's not do anything about it.
Right. And like, for anyone who might be listening to this who's confused about like how sexuality is thought about, let's just make sure we're all on the same page here. We believe very strongly that sexuality is given as a gift to married couples.
Yeah.
It is created by God. It is part of his design. And sexuality in the context of marriage is a beautiful picture of the intimacy between Christ and the church, between, God and the believer. It is, it's a beautiful part of being human. Obviously, it's necessary for, our species to continue. It has its biological components. It's also a spiritual thing. It's necessary in a marriage relationship. It's healthy. It's holy in the context of marriage. And outside of the context of marriage, sexuality is, it's a misuse of that beautiful consecrated tool. It'd be like, it'd be like in the Old Testament, taking an instrument of the temple and using it to make breakfast.
Yeah, like
right?
butter your toast.
Like, using the Ark of the Covenant as a coffee table, right? Like, there's a sacredness to sex within marriage that's lost when it's taken out of that context. So we believe that sex should be reserved for marriage, preserved for that holy space. And so that, I think, is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful part of Scripture that is so present from the very beginning of Scripture all the way throughout, right? This idea of consecrated intimacy between a husband and wife is demonstrated over and over again. It's a pattern that God puts into Scripture and that he, designed into our very being, and it's beautiful. So sexuality is very important to the life of a believer. But we believe that in the period of time where you're a sexually interested person, but you are not married, that has to be something that goes on the back burner. And you have to give, God power over your body to preserve you during that time. And the Scripture acknowledges that it's hard, right? That we love to joke about the Scripture where Paul says it's better to marry than to burn, right?
Yeah.
But what he's talking
Some
about...
people don't joke about that.
It's not a joke. What Paul was saying is, you're struggling with sexual immorality. There's a place for you to go experience sex in a holy way. It's better to marry.
Yeah.
Right? So it is undeniably difficult to be a sexually present human being and to defer that desire until you are married.
Yeah.
That is just difficult. I don't think there's any way to tiptoe around that. Maybe it's more difficult for some people than others. But it is a challenge for most people, I think, who experience that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So when I was a teenager and I was experiencing sexual desire, right, I remember praying and journaling about this, asking God to turn the switch off. Like, just, God, can you just take this away from me until I get married?
I prayed the same prayer at some point.
Right? I was so distraught. I think almost every time I went into an altar between the ages of 14 and like 21, right? I was praying for forgiveness first about sexual immorality. And it's not because I was out doing anything crazy. I was just a teenager who was interested, and I felt like I didn't have control over my thoughts the way I needed to. So I remember feeling as a teenager that I was like holding on to a stick of lit dynamite with my sexuality. And that if I didn't get my act together, right, either by really becoming, incredibly spiritual, or by getting married, it was going to explode and kill me. I'd end up with a teenage pregnancy or something. Like that was the fear, I think, that I had around my body and what it was doing to me, it felt like.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree with you more.
The thing that I think is really looking back at how I thought about dating and marriage back then, again, I started dating very young, and I dated a lot. I mean, not, I don't, a lot is relative, right? But I had, like 7-ish relationships.
I was the 7th and 8th.
Yes, I know. You love to tell people that. Once again, we mentioned the breakup. It's like every podcast. Steven's not actually bitter about the breakup. Like,
no,
anyway.
I'm not. I just love teasing her about it.
Yeah. So I dated what I consider to be a lot for, someone in that space. And I wasn't dating for the right reasons.
Yeah.
I was dating out of a need for validation, I think. I was dating because I was obsessed with romance, right?
Sure.
I had been ingesting a lot of that in books and movies and everything else. I think I was also dating that much because even though I knew as like an 18-year-old, like I wasn't getting married to the guy that I was dating right then, right? Like even if we were high school sweethearts, there was no way that we were going to be getting married within the next couple of years, right? In my mind, a dating relationship got me closer to the finish line of marriage.
Yeah.
And it was like, if I can just hold out until I get to marriage, this sounds crazy, not even out of a real desire to go fulfill that sexual desire, just a desire to not be a sinner for wanting it anymore. Mm-hmm. Like I was so scared of the sin of sexual immorality that I was racing as fast as I could, hypothetically, to get to marriage so that I could be released of that burden of sin, not even so that I could enjoy intimacy with my spouse. You know?
And it's not even that the sexual desires were the goal necessarily. But I get what you're saying in terms of wanting to be in a relationship so that way when you were ready, you were able to pull the trigger.
Yeah, like let me just keep this boyfriend on retainer so that when the opportunity to get married presents itself, I'm good.
Yeah.
Right?
In the sense of like, because it's not a good idea to just marry someone you just met, like you already have a time investment into someone else. So that way when you're available, you can pull that trigger versus saying, hey, you know what? I think I'm ready to get married now. Let me go find a boyfriend.
Well, yeah, I mean,
as a teenager, I'm talking about.
Yeah, I don't know if I was thinking about it with that kind of calculus of like, let me make sure I have someone.
No, of course not.
But I do think there was a part of me that was like, I wanted to be sure. It was a security thing of, if someone likes me enough to date me, I'll probably have someone to marry. Like, I'll probably get there, right?
Yeah.
And again, I'm dating out of a need for validation. Like that's, I think a pretty common experience.
Oh, sure.
But looking back, my view on the goals of marriage had a lot to do with outrunning sexual sin.
Yeah.
As if it were the bear chasing me and I had to just get to where I was going to find safety.
Yeah.
And I think, I meet with a lot of single people. And again, this is about our experience. I'm not trying to project this onto anybody else, but we meet with a lot of single people and talk to them about their experiences. Again, based on our original body of data, around 40% of our respondents to the project have been married before. Of those, the majority of them were married and divorced.
Yeah.
Of those, I don't have hard numbers on this, but just anecdotally based on the numbers that I think I've talked to, most of them were married to people in the church, right? Either they were in church when they got married, or they came into the church and continued to be married to the person that they were married to before they were saved, right?
Yeah.
And I've heard several versions of this story of, I felt like I needed to get married. There was a lot of pressure on me to get married. We dated for a long time and we felt like we needed to get married.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that some of this plays into that pressure to marry lest ye fall into sin of some kind.
Related to, but not exactly this topic. How has the culture changed since we were teenagers?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the culture of every church. I think my guess is that, we're still talking about sexual purity, as we should be to a degree, right? Like
Yeah, sure.
we should be talking about that. I do know that a lot of the big forces in just the Christian world have shifted away from this really hardline narrative. Joshua Harris, the guy who wrote I Kissed Dating Goodbye,
Yeah.
he recanted. He actually wrote a counter argument to his own book called, or he made a documentary called I Survived, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And then he left the faith.
Oh, man.
He got divorced. And he's, I'm not setting him up as a straw man, right? Like,
Sure.
And he was not apostolic. Like, he's not necessarily a part of our church culture, but he was this very, very strong voice. He wrote that book as a young single man, as like a 21-year-old unmarried man, and then later got married, went through a difficult marriage that ended. And I read an article where he reflected kind of on the impact that I Kissed Dating Goodbye had. And you could tell like he carried a significant amount of guilt about it. And I think the conversation had benefits as well, right? But that was an interesting point to me, that some of the loudest voices in the room around this changed.
Yeah.
So I think we have to continue to talk about consecrated sexuality.
Yeah.
Because that's doctrine. But, I'm hoping we're at the point where we're kind of slowly turning the dial back to kind of a more realistic position, I think, and narrative for young people.
Yeah. Well, and opening up dialogue about sex.
Yeah. We have to talk about sex before marriage.
That's the thing. And that's what I think we're hoping from just our culture in general, is that we start having healthy conversations around sex.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that being said, not every church is equipped with someone to have that healthy conversation.
Right.
So I understand why some churches choose not to. That being said, I think there are people out there that are equipped to, write courses, and hopefully one day we can work together with someone and try to develop that. That'd be insanely cool.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of great voices that are talking about healthy sexuality within the context of a Christian marriage.
Yeah.
And we need that.
But how do you, but also, and again, I understand from a minister's perspective, like, there is a balance between having these healthy conversations, but also being a stumbling block to teenagers and or young adults.
Right.
But I've heard too many horror stories of young men and women that get married. They ran their race. They fought the good fight. They finally made it.
They beat the bear.
And they literally get there and they're like, I have no clue what to do.
Not just that, but
and there's like severe fear and anxiety built around it now.
Right, because you've had to, again, distance yourself from your biology, from your natural desires for years, right? I mean, we're talking about, in our community, we're talking about people who have been in periods of extended singleness into their 30s and 40s.
Yeah, sometimes.
Who have had to really put on that diligent focus.
Yeah, to survive in a relationship with God and make peace with their singleness for the season of life that they're in. They have to be able to say, God, I'm giving this to you.
Right.
But how do you finally get married and go, okay, time to turn it back on again?
Yeah. And I mean, I think, there's good data to suggest that that's a real challenge for people. And there are physical impacts of that, right? Your body carries that fear. And it shows up in how people respond to intimacy in the first years of their marriage.
Yeah.
And we're passionate about making marriage good for people, right?
Yeah.
Like we want our dating practices as a culture to set people up for a marriage that is successful. And spoiler alert, like, healthy sexuality is a cornerstone of a healthy marriage.
Oh, yeah.
It's scriptural.
Yeah.
So it's a conversation that we have to start having in a different way, because we can't just, again, this goes back to the whole idea of like, our dating culture can't just be reductive, right? It's not just taking stuff out of worldly culture and leaving a vacuum.
Yeah. Because the thing is that vacuum, something else will fill that space.
Right.
Someone else will teach them something.
There will be some
and there's
boys
already an
talking about
epidemic of pornography.
Right.
There's already, like me and many of my friends were exposed to pornography at like I know some people in elementary school, but like in middle school.
Mhm.
And our church at the time, and this is not knocking them or not even my mom, like, were not having these conversations with me,
No, yeah.
and so natural curiosity, like you're getting into the stages of puberty.
Right.
You're going to have curiosities. If you don't have someone that's willing to have these conversations and say, other than don't do it.
Right. And it's so accessible. That's the
Yeah.
thing.
And so I think we need to be proactive with having conversations about it.
Right.
But that being said, I don't want to get back on that soapbox again.
Yeah. And I don't think we're equipped yet to really prescribe anything. Like,
No,
still...
I don't really know what the answer is yet. I'm just saying we need to open up the dialogue.
100%. Like, yeah, I think this is something that we as a church should put effort toward finding the right path on.
Yeah.
And should be thinking really critically about and leaning on our experts, right? We do have people in the church that are marriage and family therapists. They are trained, they're trauma informed.
Yeah.
They've done the work to really understand how to approach this.
Yeah. Trauma is a whole nother conversation of exposure to sexuality.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of stuff to feed into that. I mean, we live in a fallen world,
Sure.
right? And so we haven't gotten this right, and it's a difficult terrain to walk.
Yeah.
But how we talk about sexuality impacts how people date. And we haven't even talked about the fact that a lot of people got scared to date at all.
Yeah.
The other impact of this was another thing that was a part of my sort of process growing up. So I was dating, right? But I wasn't talking to people about it. And by people, I mean my mentors and my leadership.
Sure. Yeah.
My pastor, I certainly didn't talk to about it because I had this sense of like I was doing something wrong by dating. I was supposed to have kissed it goodbye.
Yeah. Sure.
And I had not at all. So because of that, like, sense that dating was kind of supposed to be off the table, if you were doing it if you were, actively dating as a teenager, it was sort of seen like I felt like I had to keep that quiet. Like I needed to be secretive about it. And people knew that I was dating. Like,
oh, sure.
I mean, it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing where like my youth pastor wasn't going to openly really talk about it with me in terms of what I should do in my relationship, but he would tease me about who I was going out with.
Yeah.
Right. And that was really weird. It was weird for that to be considered normal, but also taboo.
Yeah.
Oh,
actually, sorry. Speaking of that, I just realized why the conversations were not as big. Our youth group was a little bit weird in the sense that up until we had one couple that dated each other within the church, and we had a big youth group. We had like anywhere between 80 to 100 people, sometimes 120, depending. We had a big youth group at one point. Mm-hmm. And only one couple dated within each other, like within our youth group. Our youth group didn't date within each other.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a rule by any means. It's just we were all so close to friends that it wasn't something that we considered. Maybe I didn't consider it. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But that being said, I wonder if our youth pastor or the ministers at the time were like, well, our group isn't dating, so maybe these aren't conversations we need to have.
Well, but it's funny though. So years later, I started attending your church in college, right? And I was taking anthropology classes, which is like the study of human behavior and culture, right?
And you saw how weird my youth group was.
I mean, I love
West
you.
Palm.
I love you guys. I love you so much. Yes, though. Strange. Took me like a year just to figure out how to handle the sense of humor in your church. It was so funny.
If you know West Palm, you know West Palm.
Right. You definitely had your own little microclimate. But the funniest part was, so I had an assignment for my anthropology class where I needed to do what's called participant observation, right? And take notes about some cultural activity that was happening and describe it and whatever. So I chose to do participant observation at a youth service, and I asked Pastor Kyle and whatever to go do this for my school project. And I walked into the youth room, and this was in like the music room of the high school where you guys were meeting. Yeah. And it was one of those, it was a night when it was going to be like a discussion thing. So there was a big circle of chairs.
Okay.
And I kid you not, I actually drew a picture of this in my notes and turned it in for my assignment. In the circle, there was the youth leaders who were speaking. And then on one side of them were the boys. And then there was an empty chair. and then there were the girls. No one made that rule.
Yeah.
No one said it had to happen, but your youth group automatically separated by gender when it sat down.
It's the church camp effect.
Yeah, at Florida District Camp, the girls and the boys were told to
Yeah,
sit in opposite
sure.
sections, and
that wasn't like that every night, but I think majority of the time we ended up separating,
right,
not,
and that's
unintentionally.
And it's fine, right? Like, I think it's fine for youth leaders and church leaders to set up boundaries for their young people. I think it's great, actually. But it was funny. I think about it now and I was laughing because it was like, there was this implicit understanding that you hold yourself apart from someone of the opposite gender. And to do otherwise would have been seen as, dangerous, I think. Yeah. But yeah, so maybe you guys were a little more aware of it than...
Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. I know we're not experts in this field,
mm-hmm.
but going forward, what are some action steps we can do to start working towards this? Do you have any ideas?
I have some kind of like loosely formed ideas. So this is something I want us to keep talking about as we start to really, this is the whole like transforming apostolic dating culture part,
yeah.
Right? I want us to start thinking about a way that we can educate young people about consecrated sexuality, right? Waiting to engage in sex until marriage, protecting and saving themselves for marriage, but do it in a way that takes the fear of their sexuality out of it, right?
Yeah.
That diminishes the fear of dating. And I would really, really love for us to not tell young people that they shouldn't date or they shouldn't be interested in dating. Like
that they shouldn't be interested in dating. But there's got to be an age this is me saying this.
Mm-hmm.
There's got to be some sort of boundary for an age of when to date.
I agree with you, but wouldn't it be cool? Like I had this dream. Wouldn't it be cool if a young person, 13-year-old me, but like in the current times, right, comes to my youth pastor and mentions like, or my youth pastor's wife, like, I really, I have a crush on this guy or whatever. And their response is, oh my word, that's amazing. That's so exciting that you're at that age where you're starting to think about who might be a good partner for you.
Yeah.
So now it's time for us to really get educated about what your values are. It's time for us to start thinking about what a godly spouse looks like. Yeah. It's time for us to start really talking to you, young person, about your search, because you're at the very, very beginning of your search and you're not even ready to go embark on the search yet, right?
Yeah.
But you're interested. That's great. Like what would it look like if we celebrated the arrival of that interest in our young people? And it is happening earlier. We haven't really dug into that, but like,
before you go into that.
Yeah.
What's funny is there's a very similar comparison.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like our daughter, she understands that it takes money to buy things.
Yeah.
But she doesn't know how to use it or how to earn it well.
Mm.
But I can see a parallel between seeing the sparked interest and understanding of the basics of relationships and or money.
Yeah.
And saying, hey, let's use this as fuel to help them look for the right things. Yeah. Right? To help them build a budget, to help them save money, to help them give, to help them learn how to spend on themselves. So it's like how to teach them balance, but also going back to relationships, teaching them what to look for in a guy, what you need in a relationship, also financially, of what it means, what you need to eventually have together in your real world life in order to be able to get married, right?
Yeah, like I think that's the moment where we could start really holistically talking to our young people about, great, you are preparing now for an adult life.
Yeah.
Ministering with a partner, right? Yeah. Stepping into a calling with a partner. I heard one message, and I think it was Brother It was one of the Gaddies, and I don't know which Gaddy it was. Sorry. I think it might have been
Just say
Todd.
Brother Gaddy.
Yeah,
You're
Brother
good.
Gaddy. He preached a message once at one of our youth rallies, and it was the only time I've ever heard a message from the pulpit about how important it is to choose your spouse.
Yeah.
And it was beautifully done. And he said, this is the second most important choice you're ever going to make in your life after choosing to follow God. You make that choice, and then you choose who's walking beside you, you know? And so what if instead of, my first real lessons over the pulpit about dating and sexuality were coming from a place of fear, right?
Yeah.
Of here's the threat to you. Here's the threat to your body and the threat to your spirituality if you do this wrong. What if instead we said, here's what you're preparing for. It's going to be amazing, but it's going to take you a long time to get ready for this. And we have work to do.
Yeah.
We have a lot of work to unbox all the things that the world's going to tell you about dating that's not true. The things that the world's going to tell you about your body that's not true.
Yeah.
We got to take all that out of the equation, and we have to give you and equip you with the tools that the Bible has given us for how to build a healthy marriage and a healthy sexuality and a healthy outlook on life.
How cool would it be to for a kid not to fear being in a relationship just because they might have sex, but them to say, like, to understand at the age of 13, 14, 15, when they're really starting to think about these things and go, you know what? I'm going to spend this time preparing myself mentally, emotionally, financially. A big part of people in their teenage years being willing to entertain the idea of relationships is ignorance. And I'm not saying that to be mean, but they do not understand sometimes that there are financial milestones you need to meet before you can get married. There are emotional milestones, insecurities, and safeties you need to consider.
Yeah, because the movies don't include any of that.
I know, but what I'm saying is, like, going back to what you were saying about using this as an opportunity to use that knowledge of interest and saying, hey, this is a good opportunity. Instead of doing a search for truth, we do a search for relationships 101. Like,
and we should keep search for truth too. But
no,
yes,
I know. But I'm saying for specifically someone who is already saved and understands like doctrine. But it's an odd, because I feel like finances are also topics that are not talked about. Emotional relationships and health is also not talked about.
Right.
And this is just like, and this is the hard part, because the church's job should be just for spirituality.
But spirituality touches everything.
Right. And I think we focus so hard, understandably, on spirituality that sometimes we forget that there's so much more to that body that spirit is attached to.
Right. I mean, this is the whole idea behind like personal holiness, lived religion, right? Like, yeah, we need to understand salvation. We need to study scripture. We also have to live as real human beings in the world, but not of the world, and understand how to do that effectively.
Yeah.
And there's an argument to be made that it might be, in this particular scenario, that challenge might be harder than it's been historically.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go down another data rabbit hole.
Yeah, go for it.
Are you ready?
Yep.
Buckle in.
Please tell me.
Okay, so this is an article from the University of California, San Francisco Epidemiology and Biostatistics Department. And it's kind of a lightweight explainer article. This isn't a paper, but it's based on some research that's coming out of their school.
Yeah.
That looked at the age at which girls go through puberty and how that's changed over time. Puberty as measured by the age at which they menstruate for the first time, right?
Okay.
So in the 1890s, the average age of the onset of female puberty was 17 years old.
Okay.
17.
You said 1890s?
The 1890s.
Okay.
Correct. Between the 1890s and the 1950s, it fell from 17 to 12 years old.
That's it. That's a 5-year gap.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Right? It plummets. And we think about 17 as being very much a teenager and 12 as being pretty much a child, right?
Yeah.
And so it shifted that biological milestone into a much earlier phase of life.
Yeah.
Who you are at 12 is very different than who you are at 17, socially, relationally, everything, right? And it's continued to kind of shift earlier and earlier, right? Like it's not as dramatic of a drop, but we're seeing a continuation of that downward trend. And there's been some even more recent research that's really interesting about why. And this is an article from the Harvard School of Public Health. But they talk about, this is a 2024 article, so it's really recent, about some really interesting studies that looked at race and socioeconomic factors that contribute to when young women go through puberty. And they found that for women in lower socioeconomic levels or young women who are minorities, they're more likely to go through puberty earlier. So stressful or difficult situations or life circumstances will actually bring this about faster.
Okay.
So on one end, girls are, and I'm looking specifically at girls because that's a lot of the data that we have,
Oh,
right?
sure.
Girls are maturing earlier physically, biologically.
Out of necessity.
Right, out of necessity, out of a host of other factors. There's all kinds of things coming into play there that we don't even understand the full picture of in terms of, the food that we're consuming, the processes that we have, how things like, body weight changes are affecting this. There's all kinds of stuff that's still being looked at. But the other thing that's really, really interesting with this is that at the same time that that's happening, we're also seeing in the same period of time between like the 1890s and today, some pretty crazy shifts in the age of when people are getting married, right?
Okay.
So I have this handy dandy graph that I pulled from, this is from the U.S. Census Bureau, okay? So they have data about the median age at first marriage, again from 1890, which is when we first probably started, reliable census data, right, to the present. So in 1890, the median age of first marriage for women was 22.
Okay.
And for men, it was 26.
And this is for marriage?
Yeah, for their first marriage.
Okay.
So this is the median, which means that there are some people getting married as teenagers for this and some people getting married in their 40s, but that's right at the middle of the bar, okay? Yeah. Now, in comparison, or in 2023, the median age for women for their first marriage was 28. And for men, it was 31.
So you're saying in the 1890s,
Mm-hmm.
the average age for sexual maturity was 17?
Yeah.
Okay. In 1950s, it went down to 12.
Right.
5-year shift from
Mm-hmm.
the 1890s to the 1950s. And you're saying from the 1890s, the average age or the median age
Mm-hmm.
for a woman to get married, her first marriage was 22?
Right.
And it shifted to the 1950s to 28?
No, I'm sorry. In the 1950s, it actually dropped a little bit down to 20, the lowest it was ever. The current day, the present day median age is 28.
Okay.
So basically, let me kind of draw a clear line here. Women are maturing sexually earlier.
Yeah.
Biologically earlier, and statistically getting married much later. Men are theoretically doing the same thing, definitely with their marriage age, right?
Yeah.
So the length of time that a woman would have between when she reached biological sexual maturity and when she would typically get married
is about 15 years. Yeah, from 12 to 28? That's 16 years.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've taken this period of time but in between the onset of sexual maturity and marriage and elongated it enormously, right? Yeah. And in the world where sexual activity doesn't necessarily correspond to when you get married,
Yeah.
maybe that's less of a big deal.
Sure.
But for us as a church, that's a huge deal.
Yeah.
Because what we've just said is we're going to put our young people in this very, very difficult, biologically uncomfortable position for potentially 15 years longer than we used to.
Yeah.
Right. And that's not anyone's intention to do that. That's a mix of the way that our biology is changing to respond to our environment and our, how we live our lives these days.
Yeah.
And also how societal pressures around marriage have changed over time.
Yeah. Correction. You said 15 years longer than we used to. It's 11 years longer than we used to.
Let me reframe that.
No, it's okay. We can just keep it as is. I'm just wanted to throw it out there.
Okay. That makes more sense. I'm really bad with math, so we're going to have to
it's okay.
count numbers as we do this. But it's fascinating, right, to think about this. And this isn't to say, like, it's not... I don't buy into the dialogue that it's harder to be a Christian now than it ever has been, right?
Yeah.
We are not getting dragged off to coliseums to be eaten by lions, like right now, at least.
Yeah, currently.
Like, yeah. Another thing that's a complicating factor here is that we've elongated that difficult period of time, and our culture is inundating those same young people with sexual messages and sexual images and sexuality showing up in all kinds of different places that it didn't used to be, right? They didn't have internet pornography in the 1890s.
Yeah.
So it's a really difficult moment, and the church's answer to that has to be scripturally sound. We still have to stand by consecrated sexuality within the context of marriage, right? But I think we really need to be sensitive to the language of fear that we apply to it.
Yeah. Sorry, I just looked down. It's been an hour and 7 minutes already.
Oh yeah, we should probably wrap this up. It's going to be hard to put a nice bow on this conversation because we've been in all kinds of different places.
For all the listeners out there, the point of this is basically us saying that what we have been taught is not enough. And we think that opening conversations about sex and relationships and how to find a spouse, even at a younger age, is something that we need to have, because the divorce rate is still over 50%.
Yeah.
And that's not exclusive to the church. Or sorry, that's not excluding the church.
Right.
And we're not saying that this conversation is the sole reason why that number is that high, but it's a factor.
Right. Values-driven dating and taking the fear out of dating and sexuality will help our young people avoid bad church marriages.
Yeah.
It won't solve the problem entirely, but I'm confident that if we get better at this, we're going to see fewer young people who get into unhealthy relationships within the church.
Yeah.
Because those happen, and they happen with some frequency that frightens me.
Oh, sure.
And that's, I think, what we're passionate about, right? We want to equip our young people going forward, and we want to equip people that came through similar situations that we did who might be struggling with the impacts of this, to really hold those things up to the light and go, okay, let's take the good that we got from those conversations, the good things that came out of that, right? The consecration that was really instilled in us. And now let's combine it with a slightly more nuanced understanding of, how our culture has adapted to modern day dating and sexuality conversations, and move forward in a way that's healthy and whole.
Yeah. Our motto that we say is try to end loneliness in a church. And we want it to also extend to our young people.
Yeah, which is not to say that we want them to all start dating, but we want them to have hope.
When you are struggling with sexual sin and you're not being taught what to do and only told what not to do, it is a lonely situation to be in.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that to be mean. Again, I absolutely value every lesson I learn in a youth group. But this is an area where it is isolating because you're surrounded by a bunch of people who are struggling with the same things, but yet at the end of the day, no one's talking about it.
Right.
And again, these are our situations. I'm not saying everyone is the same way. But let's have this conversation.
Yeah,
Let's open it up.
Let's start talking about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is a long episode. And we're sorry.
Yeah, sorry. We'll get better at being less long-winded, maybe.
Don't promise that.
Fair. We'll try.
Every time we're like half an hour episode, and the episodes are getting longer. So
yeah, this one had complications with video and stuff. We'll have to play around with. But,
sure.
Couple of announcements. It's Father's Day weekend.
Mm-hmm. Happy Father's Day.
Happy Father's Day. We'll have I guess this will air right after Father's Day. So I hope all of our dads that are listening had a great Father's Day. If you know a single dad and you didn't get them something for Father's Day and you think that they might be looking for something or someone, a Synchrony Project gift card is not a terrible idea.
Yeah.
They can meet with us. We will, enjoy getting to know them and hopefully be able to introduce them to someone. And as a reminder, we're still doing our Operation 50/50. So if that single dad or any other single man you refer puts your name as their referrer on their Synchrony survey, we will put your name in a drawing to win $1,000 that we're going to pull at the end of July.
That's right. And we also have our $75 off for the rest of the summer.
Yep, June and July.
Yep. And so if you guys have been interested and money was the issue, this is a time to save some money.
Yep.
And let's get you match made.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, babe.
Yeah.
I love you.
I love you too. Now people are going to see your face and you say this sappy stuff to me. Are you nervous about it?
Honestly, I'm more nervous about them seeing all the other faces I've made during this whole podcast.
Yeah. We're going to have to work on our...
We are getting used to being on camera, so forgive us if it is a little unprofessional.
We're not influencers.
No.
That's not our jam, so we're learning. This is a learning curve. But it's nice to see you guys. Hopefully you've enjoyed our weird kid art walls and watching us make faces at each other for the past hour. Thanks for hanging in there.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Have a great day, guys. Thank you for listening.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.